It was a quiet evening in the small town of Maple Grove, a place where everyone knew everyone and the days seemed to blend into one another. The streets were lined with old oak trees, their leaves turning golden as autumn began to take hold. The local diner, a staple of the town, had just begun to fill up with the usual evening crowd, the hum of chatter and the clinking of coffee cups creating a soothing rhythm. Mike Matthews, a 42-year-old mechanic, had just finished closing up his shop. He wiped his hands on a rag, removing the grease that had accumulated from a long day spent working on car repairs. The shop was small but well kept, nestled between a bookstore and a corner grocery store. It wasn't a glamorous business, but it was his, and it had been his for the last 10 years. Mike was the kind of person you could count on in a pinch, always there when needed. He wasn't flashy, but he took pride in his work, and the people in town respected him for that. Mike had grown up in Maple Grove, and after graduating high school, he returned to the town and worked alongside his father in the family-owned garage. When his father passed away 5 years ago, Mike took over the business, determined to keep the tradition alive. It wasn't easy, repairs were getting more complex, and the competition from bigger, fancier shops in the nearby cities was tough to ignore. But Mike was known for his honesty, his skill with engines, and his ability to make a problem disappear in ways that only an experienced mechanic could. That evening, as Mike prepared to lock up for the night, he noticed something strange out of the corner of his eye. A car, a small, rusted sedan, was parked by the side of the road just outside his shop. It was clearly broken down, smoke was curling up from under the hood, and the car seemed to be sputtering with every attempt to start. Mike frowned. It was late, and the last thing he wanted to do was take on another job. He was exhausted, having spent hours under the hood of an old pickup truck earlier that afternoon. But there was something about the sight of the broken-down car that tugged at him. Maybe it was the fact that it reminded him of his father, who had always been there to help anyone in need, no matter the hour. Curiosity got the best of him, and he grabbed his jacket, heading out the door and toward the car. As he approached, he saw a woman standing by the driver's side, her hands on her hips, looking frustrated but not panicked. She was young, maybe in her late 20s or early 30s, and her clothes were worn, as though she had been working all day. Her face was streaked with a bit of dirt, and she had the look of someone who was barely keeping it together. "Need some help?" Mike called out, his voice gruff but kind. The woman looked up, her face lighting up with relief. "Oh, thank goodness. Yes, my car just died, and I can't get it to start. I've been trying for the past hour, but nothing's working." Mike took a quick look at the car. It was a beat-up sedan, the kind that had seen better days. The body was rusty in spots, the tires worn, and the engine, well, the engine was definitely struggling. Still, Mike had seen worse. "Let's take a look," he said, already moving toward the hood. The woman stepped back, giving him space, her eyes following him anxiously. Mike opened the hood and leaned in. The car emitted a strange smell, something between burnt oil and overworked machinery. He fiddled with a few things, checked the spark plugs, and gave the engine a few taps with a wrench. After a few minutes, he had a pretty good idea of what was going on. "You've got a busted alternator belt," Mike said, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's a simple fix, but it's gonna take a little while. You won't be able to get this thing going without it." The woman's shoulders slumped. "I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't afford to get it fixed. I'm barely keeping up with everything as it is. I have a 2-year-old at home, and my job's been cutting back on hours. If I don't get to work tomorrow, I'm going to lose my job." Mike studied her for a moment. There was something in her voice, something more than just frustration. He could hear the stress, the weight of her circumstances. Mike had known people in his life who had fallen on hard times, but there was something different about this woman. She wasn't asking for a handout, just a solution. And for some reason, that struck a chord with him. He wasn't a man who often let emotions cloud his judgment, but in this moment, he couldn't help but feel a sense of duty. He had been raised to help people when they needed it most, even if it meant making a sacrifice. His father had done it for years, and Mike had always admired that about him. "I'll fix it for you," Mike said after a long pause. "I won't charge you for the repairs." The woman blinked, clearly surprised. "What? No, you don't have to do that. I can pay you. I don't want you to lose out because of me." Mike waved her off. "I've got the time, and honestly, it's not that big of a job. Just consider it a favor." She stared at him for a moment, her lips trembling as if she were about to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she let out a deep sigh. "Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me." Mike smiled, though it was more out of habit than anything else. He wasn't the type to get emotional over a simple act of kindness, but he could sense that this small gesture was more than just a car repair for her, it was a lifeline. As he worked, the woman stayed nearby, occasionally offering to help but mostly standing quietly, watching him fix the car. Mike could tell she didn't want to be a burden, though it was clear that the weight of her struggles was wearing her down. He couldn't help but feel a little guilty for not doing more. He'd fixed cars for years, but this felt different. This was more than just a mechanical issue, it was a person's life hanging in the balance. Finally, after an hour of tinkering and tightening bolts, Mike got the car started. It roared to life with a satisfying hum, and the woman's face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She leaned against the car for support, her hands shaking slightly as she caught her breath. "You're good to go now," Mike said, wiping his hands on his jacket. "Just make sure you get that belt replaced as soon as you can. It'll save you a lot of trouble in the long run." The woman smiled through her tears, and for a moment, Mike thought she might hug him. Instead, she stepped back, looking at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't even know me. I was just hoping to get home tonight, and now I don't know what to say." Mike shrugged, trying to downplay the moment. "It's no big deal. It's just what I do." She hesitated, then pulled a crumpled envelope from her purse. "I know you said you wouldn't charge me, but I want to give you something. It's not much, but it's all I have." Mike shook his head. "You don't need to." "No, please. Take it," she insisted, holding the envelope out to him. Reluctantly, Mike took the envelope. Inside was a small amount of cash, no more than $20, but it was clear that for her, it was a lot. He couldn't bring himself to take it, though. Instead, he handed it back to her. "Listen," he said, his voice firm but kind, "just do something good for someone else when you can. That's all the payment I need." The woman blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting such a response. She seemed about to argue, but Mike shook his head and turned to head back into the shop. "I'll be fine. You take care of yourself," he called over his shoulder. As the woman drove off into the night, Mike stood there for a moment, watching her go. He didn't know her story, but he knew that she was facing battles he couldn't even begin to imagine. In that moment, he realized something that would stay with him for a long time: sometimes, a simple act of kindness could change everything. And that's how it all began, the day when Mike Matthews, a mechanic just trying to get through his day, unknowingly became part of a story that would forever change both his life and the life of a woman he barely knew. The next few days passed by in a blur for Mike, his mind still lingering on the encounter with the woman he had helped. It wasn't that he expected anything in return, but there was something about her gratefulness that stuck with him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. It wasn't as though he hadn't helped people before, he had, plenty of times. But this was different. She wasn't just a customer, she was someone who had been struggling, and for whatever reason, Mike felt a sense of responsibility toward her. As he opened the shop the following morning, he tried to shake off the thoughts of the woman and her rusty old sedan. But every time he passed by the spot where her car had been parked, his mind wandered back to that evening. Mike was a man of few words, someone who preferred to let his actions speak for him, but this time, something deep inside him felt different. The world had become a little less predictable, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. Over the next few weeks, life in Maple Grove continued as it always had. The townsfolk went about their routines, the town square bustling with the occasional weekend market, the sound of children's laughter drifting from the park. But there was a subtle shift in the air, as if everyone in town had quietly agreed that there was more to life than just the ordinary. People started to talk about Mike's act of kindness, about the mechanic who had helped a woman in need without expecting anything in return. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns. It wasn't long before the conversation moved beyond simple admiration. There were whispers, debates even. Some people wondered if Mike was just being foolish. They questioned whether someone who helped others for free was really doing anyone any favors. Others, however, saw what he had done as an example of something more, a reminder of a time when people helped one another without expecting anything in return. Mike was used to the chatter, but it began to weigh on him. He hadn't helped that woman for the praise or attention, yet that was exactly what was happening. It made him uncomfortable. He didn't want to be known as the guy who did things for publicity. His whole life had been about staying under the radar, just doing his job and going home at the end of the day. But now, it seemed like people were looking at him in a way he wasn't used to. But what bothered him more was the fact that he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, the woman he had helped. Her face kept flashing in his mind. He wondered how she was doing. He wondered if she had gotten her car fixed properly. And most of all, he wondered if she was okay. He hadn't seen her since that evening, and she hadn't come by the shop to check on the car or thank him again. Mike tried to push the thoughts out of his mind, but they wouldn't go away. So one afternoon, when there was a lull in the shop, he decided to take a drive through town to clear his head. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but somehow, his mind led him to the apartment complex where Sarah lived. He parked across the street and sat in his truck for a moment, watching the building. He saw children running in and out of the front door, their laughter echoing in the air. He imagined her inside, with her 2-year-old, trying to make ends meet. Mike didn't know much about her life, but the little he had learned made him wonder what kind of person she was, someone who had been through a lot, but was still standing. It didn't take long before Mike's curiosity got the best of him. He decided to go in and check on her, even if it was just to see if her car was running okay. Maybe it was a strange thing to do, but Mike had never been one to shy away from odd situations. He parked his truck and walked across the street, his boots tapping softly against the pavement. When he reached the entrance of the building, he paused for a moment, unsure of what to expect. He knocked on the door to her apartment. It was the kind of thing he would have never done on a normal day, but for some reason, it felt right. When Sarah opened the door, she looked surprised, though it wasn't an unwelcoming surprise. Her tired eyes brightened a little when she saw Mike standing there. "Mike," she said, blinking as if she wasn't sure if she had seen him correctly. "Hey, I just wanted to check in," he said, his voice gruff but warm. "See how the car's running." Sarah glanced behind her, clearly thinking it was a bit of an odd visit, but she smiled. "It's actually running great. I got the part one needed, and everything's been fine." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "I've been meaning to thank you again. You didn't have to do what you did, but it made a huge difference." Mike nodded, but there was an awkward silence between them. He wasn't sure what to say next, or why he was even there in the first place. Something about Sarah's life, her quiet gratitude, pulled at him. He had never been one to get too involved in other people's business, but in this case, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something bigger was at play. "I'm glad to hear it," Mike said finally. "But I've been thinking. Is everything else okay?" I mean, with you and your family. I know it's none of my business, but I figured I should ask. Sarah's face softened. She didn't seem offended by his inquiry, though she looked a bit embarrassed, like she wasn't used to people asking after her well-being. Things have been tough, she admitted, her voice a little shaky. I'm trying to juggle everything, work, the kids, keeping the bills paid, and it feels like I'm always falling behind. Mike looked at her, understanding more than she knew. He could see the weight in her eyes, the exhaustion in her posture. He hadn't known her long, but he could tell she was doing everything she could to stay afloat. You're not alone in this, Mike said, the words coming out before he could stop them. People in this town look out for each other. If there's anything you need, anything at all, I'm happy to help. Sarah met his gaze, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. She smiled, though it was faint, and nodded. I appreciate that more than you know. Mike stayed for a few more minutes, chatting about nothing in particular, but he could feel the connection growing. She wasn't someone who asked for handouts, and that made Mike respect her even more. The conversation eventually tapered off, and Mike excused himself, knowing that he had overstayed his welcome. As he left her apartment and walked back to his truck, something had changed in him. He hadn't just fixed her car, he had seen her for who she really was, someone who was doing everything she could to survive. As Mike drove back to the shop, he couldn't help but wonder how much longer Sarah would be able to keep it together. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to find out. The decision to help her had planted the seed for something far greater than a simple car repair. The events that were about to unfold would change his life, and hers, in ways neither of them could have predicted. The days continued to slip by, and life in Maple Grove seemed to return to its usual pace. Mike's shop had a steady stream of customers, many of whom were familiar faces from the town. Each car that pulled into his garage brought with it a small story, a quirky problem with a vintage car, a broken-down work truck, or a customer who needed advice about the latest model. It was the same routine that Mike had grown used to over the years, yet his thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. There was something about her quiet strength and the weight of her circumstances that lingered in his mind, making him feel like he hadn't done enough. It wasn't just about fixing her car, it was about being there for her when life seemed to be pushing her to the edge. One evening, as Mike was closing up shop, he saw her again, this time at the local grocery store. Sarah was standing in the aisle, her cart half filled with essentials, but her face was a mix of worry and exhaustion. She didn't notice him at first, and Mike debated whether he should approach her. He had already visited her apartment once, but something told him that this was the moment when he needed to step up and truly make a difference. He walked over to her, and as he did, she looked up in surprise. "Oh, Mike. I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice strained but warm. Mike gave her a small smile. "Just picking up a few things. How's everything going?" Sarah hesitated, looking down at the cart. She didn't seem like someone who was eager to share her troubles, but Mike could tell that she was struggling. There was a visible tension in her shoulders, and her eyes seemed clouded with something that went beyond the ordinary challenges of daily life. "I'm managing," she replied finally, her voice quieter than before. "It's just, things aren't getting easier. You know? It feels like everything's falling apart." Mike could see the pain behind her words, though she tried to hide it. It wasn't just the car, it wasn't just the money. It was everything. It was the weight of trying to provide for her family while drowning in stress, the never-ending cycle of work and worry that slowly chipped away at her spirit. Mike didn't know how to fix that. There was no wrench or tool for it, no simple solution. But he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. "Look," Mike said, his voice softer now. "If you need help, I'm here. I know it's not much, but I'm happy to help you with whatever you need, whether it's the car, or just talking it out. You don't have to do it all alone." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and skepticism. She didn't seem used to asking for help, much less accepting it. But for the first time, Mike could see a flicker of something in her expression, a quiet recognition that maybe, just maybe, there was hope after all. "Thank you, Mike," she said quietly, her voice breaking a little as she spoke. "I appreciate it. More than you know." Mike nodded and gave her a reassuring smile, though he didn't quite know what he was going to do next. He couldn't solve all of her problems, but he knew that he couldn't just stand by and let her carry that burden alone. Over the next few days, Mike continued his routine at the shop, but the weight of his conversation with Sarah kept nagging at him. He found himself thinking about her often, wondering what kind of life she was leading and how he could truly help. He wasn't sure if it was his guilt over the car repair, or if something else was driving him, but he felt compelled to do something more. It wasn't until one rainy afternoon, when the clouds hung heavy and the streets were slick with water, that Mike's chance came. He had just finished a complicated repair on a truck and was cleaning up when the sound of tires crunching on wet gravel caught his attention. He glanced out the window and saw Sarah's car pulling into his parking lot. The car was running smoothly now, but there was something different in the way she parked, hesitant, almost as if she wasn't sure she should be there. Mike wiped his hands on a rag and walked outside to greet her. As Sarah stepped out of the car, her eyes met his, and for a moment, Mike could see the storm behind her calm exterior. She was trying to keep it together, but the strain in her posture spoke volumes. "I wasn't sure where else to turn," Sarah said quietly. "I don't know what to do anymore. Things at work aren't getting any better. I'm behind on bills, and it feels like I'm just going in circles." Mike's heart went out to her. He could see the depth of her exhaustion now, both physical and emotional. He didn't know what to say to make it better. There were no easy answers, no magic solutions to the weight she was carrying. But Mike also knew that sometimes, just being there for someone was enough. "Tell you what," Mike said, his voice steady. "Why don't you come inside? We can grab a cup of coffee and talk. You don't have to carry this alone, Sarah." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'd appreciate that." Inside the shop, the smell of motor oil and freshly cut metal lingered in the air, but it felt different now. As Mike brewed coffee, he could see Sarah looking around, her eyes scanning the place as though it was the first time she had truly taken it all in. They sat down at the small table near the back, and for a while, neither of them spoke. It wasn't awkward, but it was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Mike wasn't sure where to begin, but he knew he couldn't just stay silent. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Mike asked after a few minutes, breaking the silence. "Anything practical, something small? I might not have much to offer, but if there's anything I can do." Sarah shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know what I need. I feel so stuck, Mike. Every time I try to fix one thing, something else falls apart. I've been doing this on my own for so long, but it's getting harder. I don't even know how much longer I can keep going." Mike listened, his heart sinking as he realized the depth of her despair. It wasn't just about her car or the bills, it was about her sense of being trapped, of having no way out. She had been fighting for so long, and now, the weight of it all was taking its toll. "You're not alone in this," Mike said, his voice firm but gentle. "Sometimes life just throws everything at you at once, and it feels like you're drowning. But you don't have to do it all by yourself. There are people who care about you, Sarah." She looked up at him then, her expression softening. "I don't know how to accept that. I'm so used to doing everything on my own. Asking for help feels like admitting that I can't do it all." Mike took a deep breath. He had spent most of his life believing that he had to fix everything, that he had to be the one to make it all right. But in that moment, he realized that sometimes, the best thing you can do is simply show up for someone. Sometimes, it wasn't about fixing things, but about being there, about giving someone the space to feel heard. You don't have to fix everything, Mike said quietly. You don't have to be perfect. And you don't have to do it alone. Let people in, Sarah. You don't have to carry this burden on your own. If you ever need a hand, I'm here. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude that made Mike's chest tighten. For the first time in a long while, she smiled, a real smile, not the weary one she had been wearing before. Thank you, Mike, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't know how much that means to me. As Mike walked her to the door, he felt something shift inside him. He hadn't solved her problems, but he had given her something even more valuable, a reminder that there were people who cared, people who would stand by her when everything else seemed impossible. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. That night, as Mike sat in his quiet home, he couldn't help but think back to everything Sarah had said. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy for her, but for the first time, it felt like she wasn't completely alone in it. And for Mike, that was enough. He didn't need recognition or repayment. He just needed to know that he had made a difference, however small, in someone's life. And as he drifted off to sleep, a thought settled in his mind. Sometimes, the most unexpected things, small mom, the weeks that followed were a mix of quiet contemplation and unexpected change. Maple Grove, like many small towns, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and news spread quickly. But what was different this time was that the news wasn't the usual gossip about someone's garden being too overgrown or the latest high school football game. This was different. This was about kindness, something people didn't always see enough of. Mike's quiet gesture to help Sarah had not only changed something inside him but had also started to shift the community's collective consciousness. It wasn't long before Sarah began showing up at the shop more frequently, often just to talk. At first, Mike had been unsure of how to handle it. He was a mechanic by trade, not a counselor, and didn't really have the skills to solve all the problems she was bringing to him. But with each conversation, something changed. Sarah began to open up, sharing more about her life and the struggles she had been facing. There were bills piling up, the endless stress of being a single mother, and the deep-seated fear that she was failing in some way. Yet, through all the difficulties, Mike saw something he hadn't noticed before, a fierce determination in Sarah's eyes. Despite everything, she wasn't giving up. One afternoon, Sarah walked into the shop with a look of quiet resolve. Mike was working on a car, his hands covered in grease, when he heard the door chime and saw her standing there, her eyes slightly brighter than usual. She hesitated for a moment, looking at him as if deciding whether to speak. Mike, she began slowly, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, the part about not being alone. I didn't believe it at first. I'm used to taking care of everything myself, but I realized I've been shutting people out for so long. Maybe it's time I let others in. Mike paused, wiping his hands on a rag and looking at her with quiet attention. He could see that she was struggling, but there was a shift in her, something stronger than before. She was tired, yes. She was tired, yes, but there was a new light in her expression, a quiet spark of hope that hadn't been there before. It was like the weight she had carried for so long was finally starting to lift, even if just a little. I'm glad to hear that, Mike said softly, setting the rag aside. It's not easy to open up, I know. But sometimes, letting people in doesn't make you weak, it makes you stronger. It takes real strength to admit you need help. Sarah nodded, her gaze steady. I don't know where to start, though. I don't have much to give, but I feel like I need to do something. I need to make a change. And I think I want to start here, with you. Mike was taken aback. He hadn't expected her to say something like that. It wasn't that he doubted Sarah's strength, but he hadn't thought she would turn to him in this way. Yet, in the quiet honesty of her words, Mike realized that she wasn't just asking for help, she was offering something, too. Maybe she didn't have much, but she had a willingness to change, to face her struggles head-on, and to open her heart to the people around her. That, in itself, was a gift. "I think you've already started," Mike said, giving her a warm smile. "You've come this far, and that's more than most people can say." It was in that moment that Mike made a decision. He couldn't fix everything in her life, but maybe, just maybe, he could help her find a way to make things better, one step at a time. He didn't know how, but he knew he couldn't turn his back on her now. From that day on, Mike and Sarah's relationship shifted. What had begun as an act of kindness had evolved into something deeper, a quiet partnership built on mutual respect and shared understanding. Mike became a steady presence in Sarah's life, offering help where he could, but more importantly, he became someone she could rely on. There were moments when Sarah would show up at the shop just to sit in the corner and talk, venting about the frustrations of her day. There were others when she would stay late, helping Mike with minor tasks around the shop, learning the ropes of mechanics. She was determined to contribute in whatever way she could, even if it was just by making Mike a cup of coffee or lending a hand with something that didn't need fixing. In her eyes, these small gestures were her way of giving back, of showing that she wasn't just a burden, she was a partner. Over time, Sarah began to feel more confident. With Mike's quiet encouragement and support, she was able to start taking small steps toward regaining control of her life. She found a part-time job working at a local diner, one that gave her the flexibility to care for her child while also helping with the bills. She enrolled in a few classes at the local community college to improve her skills, hoping to build a better future for herself and her son. It wasn't easy, there were setbacks and moments of doubt, but Sarah was learning how to balance it all. And when things got tough, she would always know that Mike was there to offer support, whether it was fixing her car or simply being someone who listened. Yet, there was still a lingering unease in the back of Mike's mind. He had been part of Sarah's journey, but he wasn't sure if he had truly helped her the way he wanted to. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something missing. And then one rainy night, months after they had first met, Sarah came to him with an unexpected request. Mike was closing the shop late, the air thick with the scent of rain, when she appeared at the door, her face drawn but determined. She held a small box in her hands, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple string. "Mike," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I've been thinking about how much you've done for me. How much you've given. I know I can't repay you for everything, but I want you to have this. It's not much, but it's something." Mike felt a pang in his chest as he took the box from her, unsure of what it was. "Sarah, you don't have to do anything for me. I'm just happy to help." But Sarah shook her head. "I know you are. But this is for you. You've shown me so much kindness, so much hope. I'm not the same person I was when I first came to you. And that's because of you." Mike didn't know what to say. The box felt heavy in his hands, but it wasn't the weight of the object inside that mattered, it was the gesture itself. Sarah wasn't just offering him something physical, she was offering her gratitude, her heart. She had transformed, and this small gift was a symbol of that transformation. With a mixture of surprise and humility, Mike opened the box. Inside, nestled in soft tissue paper, was a small brass keychain, intricately carved with the image of an engine and a wrench. It wasn't a fancy gift, but it was personal, a reminder of the bond they had shared. Mike's heart swelled, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't expected, true appreciation. "Thank you, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." As Sarah left the shop that night, Mike stood by the door for a long while, the weight of the keychain in his hand a constant reminder of how far they had both come. The gesture, though small, symbolized something much larger, the power of kindness, the impact of community, and the way in which two people, with very different lives, could come together to change each other's worlds. Mike had started out fixing a car, but what he had ended up doing was far more important. He had helped a woman find her strength again. And in return, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of purpose beyond his work, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he needed to be. In that moment, as the rain poured outside and the world seemed to settle into its rhythm, Mike knew that the road ahead for both him and Sarah was still uncertain. But one thing was clear: no matter what happened next, they had found something precious, something worth fighting for. Months passed, and the change in Sarah was undeniable. What had begun as a small moment of kindness had blossomed into a life-altering transformation for both her and Mike. It wasn't the dramatic, Hollywood-style story of instant success or sweeping triumph, but it was real, slow, steady, and filled with the quiet strength of persistence. Sarah had come a long way from the woman who had walked into Mike's garage that first day, desperate and struggling. She was still dealing with the complexities of her life, but she no longer faced them alone. The weight of her responsibilities hadn't disappeared, but now, she carried it with more grace, knowing that there were people who cared about her, who believed in her. For Mike, the journey had been different. It wasn't just about fixing cars anymore. It wasn't just about the routine of mechanics and greasy hands. In helping Sarah, Mike had found something deeper within himself, a sense of purpose that extended beyond his tools, beyond the garage. It wasn't that he had found a new career path or that he had become some kind of community hero, it was that he had found the profound impact of kindness, of being there for someone when they needed it the most. He had helped her fix her car, but she had helped him find something he hadn't realized he was missing, a reminder of the value of human connection. Sarah's progress was tangible. She had worked her way up at the diner, starting with the night shifts and gradually taking on more hours. Her child, Jacob, was thriving in school, surrounded by friends, and she had been able to get him involved in activities that gave him a sense of joy and purpose. It wasn't easy. There were still sleepless nights and overwhelming bills. There were moments when she felt like the weight of it all might break her. But when she faced those tough moments, she didn't retreat into herself. She reached out, whether to Mike, to a friend, or even to a neighbor who had become a quiet supporter. The walls she had built around herself were slowly coming down, brick by brick. One Saturday, as the early morning sun broke through the clouds and bathed the town in a warm glow, Mike decided to take a break from the shop. It had been a long week, and the hum of the machines had become a constant buzz in his head. He locked up the garage and stepped out into the crisp air, taking a deep breath as he stretched. As he walked down Main Street, heading toward the small coffee shop at the corner, he was struck by how different the town felt. It was the same Maple Grove he had known for years, but everything felt fresher, more alive. Maybe it was the quiet promise of spring, or maybe it was the subtle shift in his own heart. Whatever it was, Mike couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. When he entered the coffee shop, the familiar sound of the espresso machine and the murmur of conversation filled the air. He stood at the counter, waiting for his coffee, when the bell above the door chimed, and he turned to see Sarah walking in. She smiled when she saw him, her face lighting up in a way that made Mike feel like he was seeing her for the first time all over again. She was wearing a simple but bright dress, her hair tied back loosely, but there was something about her that looked different, stronger, more confident. "Mike," she called, waving him over. He couldn't help but smile in return, walking over to her table. As he sat down, Sarah handed him a small piece of paper. It was folded neatly, almost too neatly, and Mike raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "Just a little something," Sarah said, her voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. "I wanted to share something with you. Something that might not seem like much, but it means a lot to me." Mike unfolded the paper, and his eyes widened as he realized what it was. It was a job application, one for a position as an assistant manager at the diner where Sarah had been working. But it wasn't just any application. It was for a position that required experience and leadership, things Sarah hadn't thought she could offer. She had written the application herself, filling out each section carefully, detailing her work ethic, her dedication, and her passion for the job. "I'm not saying I'll get it," Sarah said, watching him closely. "But I wanted to show you that I'm taking steps. I'm not just sitting around hoping things get better. I'm trying to change my future, for me and for Jacob." Mike's heart swelled as he looked at her, seeing the quiet determination in her eyes. This wasn't about a car repair anymore. This wasn't about small favors or temporary fixes. This was about Sarah taking control of her own life, about making choices that would shape her future. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. "You've come a long way, Sarah," Mike said quietly, his voice filled with pride. "I'm so proud of you." For a moment, there was silence between them, a kind of understanding that didn't need words. Sarah had been so focused on the grind of survival that she hadn't realized how much she had already accomplished. She had made the decision to keep moving forward, even when things seemed impossible. And now, she was beginning to see the fruits of her labor. A week later, the diner's manager called Sarah into the office. She was nervous, her heart pounding in her chest as she walked through the door. But when she sat down across from her boss, she was greeted with a warm smile. "Sarah," her manager began, "we've been impressed with your work ethic. You've really stepped up over the last few months. And I think you're ready for the next step. We'd like to offer you the assistant manager position." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she looked at her manager. It wasn't just the job, it was the validation, the recognition of her hard work. It was the acknowledgement that she wasn't just another struggling single mother, she was someone who had something to offer, someone who deserved more than the hand she had been dealt. I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to say anything," her manager replied. "Just keep doing what you've been doing. We're proud of you." When Sarah left the diner that day, she felt a sense of triumph that she hadn't known in years. She had taken control of her life, and now she had a job that reflected her worth. But as she walked to her car, she thought about the people who had helped her along the way. She thought about Mike, the mechanic who had fixed her car and listened to her troubles. The man who had given her hope when she had none. She couldn't have gotten here without him. That night, Sarah made a decision. She wanted to show Mike how much his kindness had meant to her, how much he had helped her find her strength again. She didn't have much to give, but she knew exactly what she could do. The next morning, Sarah showed up at Mike's shop, holding a small bouquet of flowers. When he saw her standing there, his eyes softened with recognition. "Sarah, what's all this for?" he asked, surprised. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice steady. "You helped me when I needed it the most. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I couldn't have made it this far without you." Mike took the flowers, his heart full. It wasn't about the flowers or the gesture. It was about the journey they had both been on, the transformation that had taken place not just in Sarah's life, but in his own as well. "You've come a long way," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. I always knew you had it in you." As they stood there, the sound of the town buzzing around them, Mike realized that the impact of what had happened between them wasn't just about the small acts of kindness. It was about the belief in each other, the understanding that sometimes, all a person needs to rise is someone to stand with them, even if just for a moment. And in that moment, Mike knew that he had helped Sarah find her way, not by fixing her problems, but by being there when it mattered the most. In return, she had shown him what it meant to give, to care, and to believe that, even in the darkest of times, there was still hope. As the months continued to pass, Maple Grove began to feel different. It wasn't as if the town itself had changed, but the atmosphere had shifted in subtle ways. People who once hurried past each other now slowed their steps, offering smiles or words of encouragement. There was a sense of community, of belonging, that hadn't been there before. And at the heart of it all was Mike's garage, a place that had become a symbol of kindness and connection, where the smallest gestures held the power to transform lives. For Sarah, life had taken on a new rhythm. With her new job as the assistant manager at the diner, she had found a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in years. She no longer felt like a passive observer in her own life, but an active participant, steering her future in a direction she never thought possible. Jacob, her son, had adapted to the changes, and he was thriving in school. Sarah took pride in watching him grow, knowing that the future was brighter for both of them. It wasn't just the job that made her feel fulfilled, it was the fact that she was no longer isolated in her struggles. She had Mike to thank for that. Mike, too, found his life changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. When he had first agreed to fix Sarah's car, he had no idea that his simple act of kindness would lead to such a profound impact on his own life. Over time, he had come to understand the quiet power of being there for someone, of listening when words were needed, of offering help without expecting anything in return. His relationship with Sarah had grown into a lasting friendship, and through it, he had gained something he hadn't realized he was missing, a deeper sense of purpose. The shop was still his place of work, but now it felt like more than that. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where people could come to not just fix their cars, but to find understanding and support. On an unusually warm day in late spring, Mike found himself working on a classic car that had been brought in by one of his regular customers. The steady hum of the garage was familiar, comforting. But as he bent over the engine, tightening a bolt, his mind kept drifting back to Sarah. He had been so proud of her when she had landed the assistant manager position. It wasn't just the job, it was the courage she had shown in taking control of her life. She had faced adversity with a quiet strength, and watching her grow had reminded Mike of the power of resilience. But even more than that, it had reminded him of the power of small actions, the kind that went unnoticed but held the potential to change everything. Later that afternoon, as Mike finished up the work on the car, he received an unexpected visit. The bell above the shop door jingled as it opened, and Mike looked up to see Sarah standing there, holding a bag in her hand. She looked different than usual. There was a confidence in her posture, a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. Her eyes sparkled, and she was smiling, a smile that seemed to come from deep within. "Hey, Mike," she greeted him, her voice warm and full of gratitude. "Got a minute?" "Of course," Mike said, wiping his hands on a rag and setting it aside. "What's going on?" "I wanted to bring you something," Sarah said, holding out the bag. "It's not much, but I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I know I've thanked you before, but I wanted to do something special." Mike raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her words. "Sarah, you don't have to." "I know," she interrupted, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "But I want to." He chuckled, taking the bag from her and carefully pulling out its contents. Inside, he found a set of keys, beautifully polished and etched with an intricate design. They weren't just any keys. These were to a vintage motorcycle, a bike Mike had admired for years but had never had the chance to own. It was a classic, a symbol of freedom and adventure, and it had always been a dream of his to restore it someday. "Sarah, this is unbelievable," Mike stammered, completely taken aback. "Where did you find this?" "I didn't find it," she said with a knowing smile. "I bought it for you." Mike's eyes widened as the realization hit him. "You bought this for me?" Sarah nodded. "I know it's a big gift, but I wanted to do something to show you how much you've meant to me. You've given me so much, help, support, kindness. You've shown me what it means to believe in myself, and now I want to give you something that's been on your wish list for a long time. I can't repay you for everything, but maybe this will show you how much your generosity has meant." For a long moment, Mike was speechless, holding the keys in his hand, unsure of what to say. The weight of the gesture hit him deeply. This wasn't just about the bike. It was about everything Sarah had gone through, everything she had achieved, and the way in which she had paid it forward. She wasn't just thanking him for fixing her car, she was thanking him for being the person who had helped her rebuild her life. I don't know what to say, Mike finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. This is incredible, Sarah. I never expected anything like this. I know you didn't, she replied gently. But you've made such a difference in my life. You were there when I needed you most. You showed me that I wasn't alone, and you helped me find the strength I didn't know I had. I wanted to do something that would mean as much to you as everything you've done for me. Mike looked at her, his heart full. It wasn't about the motorcycle, it wasn't about the material gift at all. It was about the message behind it, that kindness, no matter how small, had the power to change lives. Sarah had shown him that. She had given him a gift far greater than any object could offer. She had given him the reminder that sometimes, the most important thing we can do for each other is to show up, to be there, and to believe in each other even when things seem impossible. Thank you, Sarah, Mike said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. This is more than I ever could have hoped for. Sarah smiled, her eyes warm. You've already given me so much, Mike. I wanted to give you something, even if it's just a small token of my appreciation. They stood there in the quiet of the shop, the only sound the faint hum of the world outside. Mike looked down at the keys in his hand, a symbol of something far bigger than a motorcycle. It was a symbol of their journey together, of how one small act of kindness had set off a chain of events that had changed both of their lives. As the days went on, Mike and Sarah's bond continued to grow. The motorcycle became a new project for Mike, one that he approached with the same passion and dedication he had brought to every other job in the shop. But it wasn't just about the bike. It was about the fact that Sarah had trusted him, had given him something that represented everything they had been through together. In the months that followed, Mike and Sarah continued to support each other, watching each other's lives unfold in unexpected ways. Sarah had earned the respect and admiration of her co-workers at the diner, and her confidence continued to grow as she took on more responsibilities. Jacob was thriving, excelling in school, and developing new interests that brought him joy. And Mike, as he worked on restoring the motorcycle, found himself rediscovering a love for life that he hadn't realized he had lost. Together, they had weathered the storms of life, and together, they had emerged stronger. Their story was one of perseverance, of kindness, and of the quiet power of human connection. What had started with a simple gesture, Mike fixing a car for a struggling woman, had grown into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness had the power to change everything, and that no matter how difficult life may seem, there is always hope, always a chance for redemption, always a possibility for transformation. And so, as the sun set on another day in Maple Grove, Mike and Sarah stood together, looking out over the horizon. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure: they would face it together, with hope in their hearts and the unwavering belief that no matter how hard life got, they could make it through as long as they had each other. And as for the motorcycle, it would become more than just a project, it would become a symbol of their journey, a reminder that sometimes, the road to happiness is a long one, but it's worth it.